The cabin sat like a broken tooth against the Colorado mountainside, its roof caved in and walls black with decades of rot. Jake Thornfield stared at the deed in his weathered hands, still unable to believe his first lucky break in 40 years of living alone on the mountain. He'd won this wreck in a poker game with 3 aces, the best hand he'd ever drawn in his life. But Jake wasn't just any mountain hermit. 20 years ago, he'd been sheriff of Copper Falls until his wife Sarah vanished without a trace, taking his badge, his reputation, and his will to live with her. Everyone said she'd run off with another man. Jake had retreated to these peaks to drink away the shame. Now, as he tore into the cabin's rotten walls to salvage what he could, his crowbar hit something that shouldn't be there, a metal box hidden behind the planks. Inside, Sarah's wedding ring caught the light, along with a stack of letters in her handwriting, letters dated after she'd supposedly disappeared. What had his wife been hiding in this godforsaken place, and why had fate finally decided to show him mercy? Jake's hands trembled as he lifted the first letter from the box. The paper felt fragile, yellowed at the edges, but Sarah's careful script was unmistakable. He'd seen it on grocery lists, birthday cards, and love notes tucked into his lunch pail during their 5 years of marriage. The date at the top made his breath catch, October 15th, 1994, 3 months after she'd vanished. My dearest Jake, if you're reading this, then maybe there's still hope. I can't come home yet, not while they're watching. Deputy Morrison isn't who you think he is. The missing evidence from the Hartwell case, the drugs that disappeared from the station, it wasn't random. He's been using the department to cover his tracks, and when I found out, he threatened to kill you if I didn't disappear. I've been staying in different places, trying to gather proof. This cabin belongs to my cousin Pete. You remember him from Denver. He said I could use it as long as I needed. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth. Morrison said he'd make it look like an accident, and I couldn't risk your life. Jake sank onto an overturned crate, his legs suddenly unsteady. Morrison had been his deputy for 8 years, the man he'd trusted to help search for Sarah, the man who'd consoled him when the search turned up nothing, the man who'd eventually taken over as sheriff when Jake's drinking made him unfit for duty. He grabbed the next letter, dated 2 months later. I found something today. Morrison's been working with the Castellano family, moving their product through the county. Remember how evidence kept disappearing from drug cases? It was him, Jake, all of it. I have photographs now, documents, but I need more to make it stick. I know you think I abandoned you, and it's killing me, but if I come back too soon, we'll both end up dead. The letters painted a picture of a woman living in fear, moving between safe houses, slowly building a case against a corrupt deputy. Sarah had been protecting him all along, and he'd spent 20 years believing she'd stopped loving him. Jake's throat tightened as he read about her watching the town from a distance, seeing him stumble drunk out of bars, knowing she couldn't reach out without putting him in danger. She'd documented Morrison's crimes methodically, but the final letters grew increasingly desperate. The last one was dated only 6 months after her disappearance. Jake, I think Morrison suspects I'm alive. Someone broke into Pete's cabin in Denver, the one where I've been hiding most of my evidence. I'm moving everything here to this old place on Copper Ridge. If something happens to me, look for the loose floorboard by the fireplace. I've hidden everything there. I love you more than the stars love the sky. Whatever happens, please know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. You were always the best man I knew. The letter ended abruptly. Jake's hands shook as he searched the box for more, but there was nothing else except Sarah's ring and a small brass key he didn't recognize. He looked toward the fireplace, where weeds now grew through the crumbling hearth. 20 years of weather had warped the floorboards, but he could see one section that sat slightly higher than the rest. Jake crawled over and pried at it with his crowbar. The board came up easily, revealing a metal strongbox that fit the brass key. Inside were photographs of Morrison meeting with men Jake recognized as known drug dealers, financial records showing deposits to offshore accounts, copies of evidence logs with Morrison's signature documenting items that had mysteriously vanished from the station. And at the bottom, a newspaper clipping that made Jake's blood run cold. Sarah's obituary, dated just 2 months after that final letter. Killed in a car accident in Nevada, it said. Her body had been cremated before any family could be notified. Jake stared at the yellowed newsprint, his mind reeling. Morrison hadn't just silenced Sarah. He'd made sure she could never come back to expose him. And then he'd taken Jake's job, his authority, his entire life. But Morrison had made one mistake. He'd never found this cabin. And after 40 years of bad luck, Jake had finally drawn the hand that would let him play for revenge. The cabin stood like a broken tooth against the Montana sky, its roof sagging under decades of snow and neglect. Jake parked his rusted pickup 50 yards away, studying the structure through eyes that had learned to expect disappointment. Even winning felt like losing when you'd been dealt nothing but bad hands for 4 decades. He'd driven the winding mountain road in silence, the deed to the property folded in his shirt pocket like a question mark. Sam Hendricks had thrown the cabin into the pot with a desperate grin, 3 whiskeys deep and holding nothing but a pair of 7s. Jake's modest straight had felt like hitting the lottery, though he knew better than to trust good fortune. The cabin's front porch had collapsed entirely, leaving the door suspended 3 feet above a tangle of rotted lumber and rusted nails. Windows stared back at him like hollow sockets, glass long since claimed by stones or weather. What had once been a chimney now resembled a broken finger pointing accusingly at the grey October sky. Jake retrieved his toolbox from the truck bed, the metal handles worn smooth by years of odd jobs that barely kept him afloat. His own place, a single-wide trailer tucked behind Millfield's only gas station, wasn't much to look at, but at least it had running water and electricity. This cabin offered nothing but splinters and memories he couldn't quite place. Something about the location nagged at him as he approached the structure. The valley felt familiar, though he couldn't recall visiting this particular stretch of wilderness. Pine trees crowded close to the building, their branches scraping against what remained of the metal roofing whenever the wind picked up. A creek gurgled somewhere beyond the tree line, its voice carrying notes that seemed to echo in his chest. He found a way inside through a gap where the back wall had partially caved in. The interior smelled of mouse droppings and decay, with mushrooms sprouting from the corners where moisture had claimed the floorboards. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, illuminating dancing dust motes and the skeletal remains of furniture. Jake set down his toolbox and really looked around for the first time. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with what had once been a kitchen separated from the main room by a breakfast bar. A narrow hallway led toward what he assumed were bedrooms, though the ceiling had collapsed partially, blocking his view. He pulled on work gloves and began clearing debris, starting with the larger pieces of fallen timber. The wood came away in chunks, revealing glimpses of the walls beneath. Whoever had built this place had done solid work before time and weather took their toll. The foundation stones were carefully fitted, and the remaining wall studs showed the kind of attention to detail that spoke of pride in craftsmanship. After an hour of steady work, Jake had cleared enough space to move freely through the main room. He was reaching for a section of collapsed ceiling when his fingers brushed against something that didn't belong, not wood or metal, but fabric. He worked more carefully now, pulling away smaller pieces until he could see what he'd found. A piece of cloth, faded blue denim, was wedged between 2 wall studs. Jake's heart began beating faster as he worked it free. The fabric was worn soft, the way material gets when it's been loved and washed hundreds of times. It was a pocket from a jacket, a woman's jacket, judging by the size and the small pearl button still attached by a few stubborn threads. Jake turned it over in his hands, and his breath caught in his throat. He knew this pocket, had watched Sarah sew that button back on at their kitchen table, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on the delicate work. The jacket had been her favorite, the one she wore on morning walks and evening drives, the one she'd been wearing the last time anyone in town had seen her, 20 years ago, when Sarah Whitmore had simply vanished. Jake sank onto a relatively stable section of flooring, the pocket clutched in his trembling hands. The official story had never satisfied him, but he'd been forced to accept it. Sarah had left him, the sheriff had concluded. Probably for another man, maybe for a new life in some distant city. Her car was gone, along with some clothes and her savings account. Case closed. But Sarah had loved that jacket too much to leave it behind. He looked around the ruined cabin with new eyes, seeing not just decay but possibility, evidence, questions that demanded answers. The familiar feeling about this place crystallized into something sharper, more urgent. Sarah had been here. Jake stood on unsteady legs and walked to where he'd found the pocket. If there was one piece of her clothing hidden in these walls, there might be others. There might be answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask for 2 decades. He picked up his crowbar and began tearing into the wall with purpose, each strike echoing through the valley like a promise. Jake's hands trembled as he held the faded photograph, his calloused fingers tracing the edges worn soft by time. Sarah smiled back at him from 20 years in the past, her dark hair catching sunlight that would never shine on her again. But it was the writing on the back that made his chest tighten, her familiar script spelling out for my darling Jake, all my love always S, the same handwriting that had appeared on the note claiming she was leaving him for someone else. He set the photograph carefully on the cabin's rickety table and returned to the hole in the wall. His crowbar bit into more rotting wood, and another board came away with a wet splintering sound. Behind it, wedged deeper into the cavity, something metallic glinted. Jake's breath caught. He knew that silver bracelet before his fingers even touched it. He'd saved for 3 months to buy it for Sarah's birthday, back when they were young and broke and foolishly happy. The delicate chain had broken years ago, and she'd been heartbroken, keeping the pieces in her jewelry box with promises to fix it someday. But here it was, mended. Someone had carefully soldered the links back together, polished away the tarnish. Sarah would never have thrown this away, would never have left it behind. She'd treasured that bracelet like it was made of diamonds instead of silver-plated tin. The mountain wind picked up outside, whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls and making the whole structure groan. Jake barely noticed. His mind was racing backward through the last conversation he'd had with his wife, searching for clues he'd missed, words that might have meant something different than what he'd understood. She'd been quiet that final week, distracted. He'd assumed she was having second thoughts about their isolated life, about the dreams they'd chased into these unforgiving mountains. The mining claims that never panned out, the get-rich-quick schemes that left them poorer than before, the long winters when they barely spoke to another human being for months. But what if her silence hadn't been about leaving? What if she'd been afraid? Jake's hands moved automatically, pulling away more boards, desperate now to see what else might be hidden. The wood came away easier here, as if someone had hastily repaired this section without proper tools or time. Behind the makeshift wall, the space opened into a larger cavity that shouldn't have existed in a cabin this size. His flashlight beam swept across the darkness and froze. More of Sarah's things lay scattered in the hidden space, like offerings in a shrine. A book of poetry he'd given her for Christmas, its pages yellowed but intact. The small ceramic bird she'd bought at a roadside stand during their honeymoon, its blue paint still vibrant. A silk scarf that had been her mother's, folded neatly as if someone had been careful with it. But it was the notebook that made Jake's blood run cold. Sarah's journal lay open to the final entry, her handwriting growing increasingly erratic across the page. He pulled it toward him with shaking hands, squinting to make out words written in obvious haste and fear. "He won't stop watching the house. Jake doesn't believe me, thinks I'm imagining things, but I know someone's out there. Found footprints by the bedroom window this morning, different boots than Jake's. Someone's been coming around when he's working the claim." Jake's vision blurred. He'd dismissed her concerns, told her she was letting the isolation get to her. Mountain living did that sometimes, made people see shadows where there were none, hear footsteps in the wind. He'd been so certain that her fears were just cabin fever. The entry continued, "Going to town tomorrow to talk to Sheriff Morrison. Jake thinks I'm being foolish, but something's not right. If anything happens to me, it wasn't random. Check the old Mackenzie place. I've seen lights there at night when it's supposed to be empty." The handwriting stopped mid-sentence, the pen trailing off as if someone had been interrupted. Jake sank back on his heels, the journal clutched against his chest. The Mackenzie place. He knew it well. An abandoned homestead about 5 miles north, built by some fool prospector in the 1800s and left to rot when the gold ran out. Jake had always assumed it was empty, avoided it because the trail was treacherous and there was nothing worth seeing. But Sarah had seen lights there. Outside, something rustled in the brush near the cabin. Jake's head snapped up, every nerve suddenly alert. Just wind through the pine branches, he told himself. Just his imagination running wild after 20 years of guilt and grief. But as he sat motionless in the growing darkness, listening to the mountains settle into night around him, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. That somewhere in the shadows between the trees, someone was watching. Someone who knew exactly what he'd found. The photograph trembled in Jake's weathered hands as dawn light filtered through the cabin's broken windows. 20 years had passed since he'd last seen Sarah's face, but the woman in the Polaroid was unmistakably her. Same auburn hair, same gentle eyes that had once looked at him with such love. Only now those eyes held terror. He studied the image more carefully. Sarah sat bound to a wooden chair, duct tape across her mouth, her face streaked with tears. Behind her, he could make out what looked like concrete walls and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written in black marker, "Day 3. Day 3 of what? Jake's chest tightened as the implications crashed over him. All these years, he'd believed Sarah had simply grown tired of their isolated life, tired of his drinking, tired of him. The note she'd supposedly left had said as much, that she needed something more than what he could give her, that she was starting fresh somewhere far away. He'd kept that note, read it until the paper wore thin, believing every cruel word about his inadequacy as a husband. But if this photograph was real, if it showed what he thought it showed, then Sarah hadn't left him at all. She'd been taken. Jake set the photo on the makeshift table formed by a piece of plywood balanced on 2 sawhorses and reached for the folded papers beneath it. His hand shook as he opened the first sheet, a ransom note composed of letters cut from magazines and newspapers. "We have your wife. $50,000 cash or she dies. No police. Await instructions." The paper felt brittle, aged. Jake turned it over, looking for any other clues, then opened the second sheet. This one was handwritten in the same black marker as the photo's inscription. Payment drop failed. Target didn't show. What now? And below that, in different handwriting, shakier, clean it up, all of it. Jake's legs gave out, and he sank onto an overturned crate. The ransom note explained everything. Why Sarah's disappearance had seemed so sudden, why she'd left behind her grandmother, ring, and the little music box she'd treasured since childhood. She hadn't packed because she hadn't planned to leave. But who had taken her? And why had the ransom drop failed? He thought back to that terrible week 20 years ago, trying to remember details he'd been too drunk and heartbroken to process at the time. Sarah had vanished on a Tuesday while he was in town selling firewood. He'd returned to find the house empty and that damning note on the kitchen table. No signs of struggle, no indication of foul play, or so he'd thought. Had there been a phone call he'd missed? Instructions he'd never received because he'd been too busy drowning his sorrows at Mickey's bar. The possibility that his own negligence might have cost Sarah her life made bile rise in his throat. Jake forced himself to examine the remaining evidence. There were more photographs, 5 in total, each marked with a different day. In the later images, Sarah looked increasingly desperate, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. The final photo was marked Day 7 and showed an empty chair with ropes still attached to the arms. Beneath the photographs lay a small piece of fabric, pale blue cotton that Jake recognized immediately as coming from the dress Sarah had been wearing the day she disappeared. The fabric was stained with something dark that might have been blood. The last item in the plastic bag made Jake's blood run cold. It was Sarah's wedding ring, the simple gold band he'd placed on her finger 13 years before her disappearance. She'd never taken it off, had claimed it was stuck on her finger from years of wear. Someone had removed it by force. Jake clutched the ring in his fist, feeling the familiar weight of it, and let out a sound that was part sob, part roar of rage. For 20 years, he'd carried the burden of believing himself unworthy of love, convinced that Sarah had seen through his failures and found him wanting. The truth was infinitely worse. She'd been murdered because of a ransom demand he'd never received, killed by monsters who'd probably watched him stumble around town in a drunken stupor while they waited for contact that never came. But why hide the evidence here, in this rotting cabin? Who was Ezra Collins, and what connection did he have to Sarah's disappearance? Jake wiped his eyes and gathered the photographs and papers with new resolve. The local sheriff's department had written off Sarah's case years ago, filing it as a voluntary missing person despite Jake's protests. They'd probably dismissed him as a delusional drunk clinging to false hope. Now he had proof they'd been wrong. The question was whether anyone would still care about a 20-year-old murder, or if Jake would have to find justice for Sarah on his own. Either way, he wasn't walking away from this cabin until he knew the whole truth. The morning light filtered through the broken windows of the cabin, casting long shadows across the debris-strewn floor. Jake had barely slept, his mind churning over the implications of what he'd found. Sarah's wedding ring, hidden beneath decades of rot and neglect, seemed to burn a hole in his shirt pocket where he'd carefully placed it. He stood in the doorway, coffee mug trembling in his weathered hands, studying the cabin with new eyes. What had seemed like a simple demolition project yesterday now felt like an archaeological dig. Every board he'd torn away, every nail he'd pulled, could be hiding another piece of the puzzle that was Sarah's disappearance. The rational part of his mind whispered the same explanations he'd heard 20 years ago. Sarah had been unhappy. The isolation had gotten to her. She'd taken the ring off, maybe thrown it away in anger before she left. But Jake knew his wife, knew how she'd treasured that simple gold band, even when they could barely afford food. He set down his coffee and picked up the crowbar again. The wall where he'd found the ring was only half demolished. Behind the rotting boards, he could make out older construction, hand-hewn logs that spoke of the cabin's original builders from decades past. As he pried away another section of planking, something white caught his eye. Paper, wedged between two logs, protected from the elements by the newer wall that had been built in front of it. Jake's heart hammered as he carefully extracted what appeared to be an envelope, yellowed with age but still intact. His name was written across the front in familiar handwriting. Sarah's handwriting. With shaking fingers, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink slightly faded but still legible. As he read, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jake, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I've been getting letters, threatening ones. Someone knows about what happened that summer before we met, and they want me to pay for my silence. I never told you about Denver, about why I really left the city. I thought I could run from it, that starting over with you would be enough. But the past has found me. I'm scared, Jake. If something happens, look for the red truck. He drives a red truck and he knows these mountains better than anyone. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this face to face. S. Jake read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Sarah hadn't left him. Someone had threatened her, possibly taken her. The relief and anguish hit him simultaneously, relief that she hadn't abandoned their marriage, anguish that she'd been in danger and he'd never known. A red truck. 20 years ago he'd been so consumed with his own pain and the assumption that Sarah had simply grown tired of their hard-scrabble life that he'd never thought to look for evidence of foul play. The sheriff had treated it as a routine missing person case. Woman leaves husband, happens all the time. No investigation, no follow-up. Jake's mind raced through memories of that time. Who had driven a red truck? Half the county, it seemed like. But someone who knew these mountains well, that narrowed it down. A local. Someone Sarah had encountered regularly enough to feel threatened by. He carefully folded the letter and placed it in his wallet next to his driver's license. Evidence. After 20 years, he finally had evidence that Sarah's disappearance wasn't what it seemed. As the initial shock wore off, new questions flooded in. What had happened in Denver? What secret had Sarah been carrying, and why had she hidden this letter in the cabin instead of coming to him directly? The answer to the last question seemed obvious now. She'd been planning to tell him, but she'd never gotten the chance. Whoever was threatening her had moved faster than she'd anticipated. The letter was insurance, a message in a bottle cast into an uncertain future. Jake looked around the cabin with fresh purpose. If Sarah had hidden the letter here, there might be other clues. She'd been careful, methodical. The woman who organized their sparse belongings with military precision wouldn't have left just one piece of evidence. He attacked the remaining walls with renewed vigor, not just demolishing now, but searching. Every crevice, every gap between boards became a potential hiding place. The morning stretched into afternoon as he worked, sweat mixing with decades-old dust. As the sun reached its zenith, his crowbar struck something that didn't sound like wood or metal, hollow, plastic. Jake's pulse quickened as he carefully extracted a small Ziploc bag from inside the wall cavity. Inside was a photograph and what looked like a newspaper clipping. The photograph showed Sarah standing next to a young man Jake didn't recognize. They were both smiling, but something in their eyes suggested tension. On the back, in Sarah's handwriting, Marcus, Denver, 1972. The newspaper clipping made Jake's blood run cold. Local businessman found dead. Police suspect foul play. Jake's hands trembled as he held the photograph up to the dying light filtering through the cabin's broken window. The woman in the picture had Sarah's gentle eyes, her soft smile, but something was wrong. The timestamp in the corner read March 15, 2004, 3 months after Sarah had supposedly left him. He sank onto an overturned crate, his mind racing. Sarah had vanished on December 18, 2003. He remembered the date like a scar burned into his soul. She'd left behind a note saying she couldn't handle the isolation anymore, that she needed a different life. But this photograph suggested she'd been alive, somewhere, months later. The cabin groaned around him as wind picked up outside. Jake studied every detail of the image. Sarah wore a blue dress he'd never seen before, and behind her stood what looked like a small-town main street. A blurry sign in the background showed partial letters. Willow Creek. His pulse quickened. Willow Creek was only 60 miles south, a place they'd driven through once on their way to Denver. Jake flipped the photograph over. In faded pencil, someone had written, "For insurance, Mr." Those initials meant nothing to him, but the handwriting was definitely not Sarah's. Her cursive had been flowing and feminine. This was angular, masculine. Someone had taken this picture of his wife and written those cryptic words. But why? He searched through the debris more frantically now, his earlier methodical approach abandoned. Behind a loose board near what had once been a kitchen, he found a manila envelope wrapped in plastic. Inside were more photographs, all of Sarah, all time-stamped between January and April of 2004. In one, she sat at a diner counter, looking thin and tired. In another, she walked down a residential street, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The final image made Jake's breath catch. Sarah entering a small house with white shutters, a man's hand visible on her shoulder, guiding her inside. Jake's chest tightened with a mixture of hope and dread. Sarah hadn't left him voluntarily. These pictures told a story of surveillance, of someone tracking her movements. But who was Mr., and why had he been watching Sarah? The last photograph in the envelope showed Sarah through a window, sitting at a table across from a man whose face was partially obscured by shadows. She looked scared, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The timestamp read April 3, 2004. After that date, there were no more pictures. Jake stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cabin. 20 years. He'd spent 20 years believing Sarah had abandoned their marriage, that she'd chosen city life over their mountain existence. The guilt had eaten at him, Maybe if he'd been more social, less of a hermit, she would have stayed. Maybe if he'd taken her to town more often, shown her more affection, been the man she deserved. But these photographs painted a different picture entirely. Sarah hadn't left, she'd been taken. As darkness settled over the cabin, Jake lit the Coleman lantern he'd brought with him. The warm glow cast dancing shadows on the walls, and he noticed something else. Carved into one of the wooden beams were initials, Mr. plus DK below them, a date, summer 1985. Jake's mind worked backward. In 1985, he would have been 25, still living in town, working at the lumber mill. He'd bought the mountain property in 1987, met Sarah in 1989. Whoever Mr. was, he'd known this area long before Jake had ever set foot in these mountains. A sudden realization struck him. The poker game. Morris Rutherford, the old man who'd practically given away this cabin, his initials were Mr. Jake, had thought Morris was just eager to unload the worthless property. But what if there was another reason? What if Morris had wanted Jake to find these photographs? The wind howled outside, and Jake pulled his jacket tighter. Morris Rutherford had been watching Sarah 20 years ago. He'd hidden evidence in this cabin, evidence that proved Sarah hadn't left willingly. But Morris was dying. Jake had seen the pallor in his face, the way he'd struggled to breathe during the card game. Was this his confession? His way of revealing the truth before death silenced him forever? Jake carefully gathered all the photographs and tucked them into his jacket. Tomorrow he would drive to Willow Creek, show Sarah's picture around, see if anyone remembered her. 20 years was a long time, but small towns had long memories. As he prepared to leave the cabin, Jake took one last look around the space that had yielded such devastating secrets. The rotting walls had hidden the truth for 2 decades, but now that truth was free. Sarah hadn't abandoned him, but that knowledge brought no comfort. If she'd been taken, if someone had been controlling her movements, photographing her like prey, then what had happened to her after April 2004? Jake stepped into the cold mountain night, his world forever changed by what lay hidden in the walls. The old photograph trembled in Jake's weathered hands as he sat on the cabin's front steps, dawn breaking through the pine trees around him. Sarah's face smiled back at him from the faded image, young, radiant, her dark hair catching sunlight from a day 23 years past. But it wasn't nostalgia that made his chest tight with dread. It was the knowledge that this photo had been taken 2 years after she'd supposedly left him. He'd found it wedged between the floorboards along with her wedding ring and a fragment of fabric that matched the blue dress she'd worn their last morning together. The dress she'd been wearing when she walked out the door, claiming she couldn't handle his drinking anymore. Couldn't watch him destroy himself in these mountains. Jake had believed that story for 20 years. Hell, he'd lived it, drowning his guilt in bottle after bottle, becoming exactly the man she'd said he already was. Now he wondered if Sarah had ever left the mountains at all. The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. A dusty pickup truck wound up the narrow road, and Jake recognized the driver immediately. Tom Brewster, who owned most of the land in this section of the valley. Tom had been one of the few people who'd bothered checking on Jake over the years, though their friendship had cooled considerably since Sarah's disappearance. Tom climbed out of his truck slowly, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his worn baseball cap. "Heard you've been doing some renovations up here." Word travels fast. Jake slipped the photograph into his shirt pocket, his fingers lingering protectively over it. Mountain folk talk, especially when someone starts tearing down the old Hendricks place. Tom's eyes swept over the cabin, taking in the exposed framework, the pile of rotted boards, the careful way Jake had stacked and sorted everything he'd found. "Find anything interesting?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jake studied his old friend's face, searching for something he couldn't quite name. Mice, rot, the usual. Tom nodded, but his gaze kept returning to the cabin's interior. "You know, I always wondered why old Hendricks abandoned this place so sudden-like. One day he was here, next day gone. Never even came back for his things. When was that?" "Oh, must have been..." Tom scratched his chin, as if calculating. 20 years ago, give or take, right around the time Sarah took off. The casual way he said it made Jake's blood run cold. Too casual, too precise. Funny coincidence, Jake said carefully. Mountains are full of coincidences. Tom walked closer to the cabin, his boots crunching on scattered debris. Mind if I take a look inside? Always was curious about this old place. Every instinct Jake had developed during 40 years of hard living screamed at him to say no. Instead, he stood and gestured toward the door. Help yourself, though there's not much to see. Tom stepped inside, and Jake watched him move through the space with surprising familiarity. The man's eyes went immediately to the corner where Jake had found the photograph, then to the exposed section of wall where the ring had been hidden. You cleared out a lot of debris, Tom observed. Needed to see what I was working with. Smart. Never know what you might find in these old places. Sometimes they hold on to secrets longer than they should. Tom turned to face Jake directly. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, you know. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jake felt the photograph burning against his chest like a brand. I'm just fixing up a cabin, Tom. Nothing more complicated than that. Course you are. Tom's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just remember, Jake, these mountains can be dangerous for folks who go poking around where they shouldn't. Easy to have an accident up here, easy to disappear. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. 20 years of self-doubt and guilt began crystallizing into something harder, sharper. Certainty. Like Sarah disappeared? Tom's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A coiling, like a snake preparing to strike. Sarah left Jake. We all saw her go, saw her pack her car, saw her drive down to the main road. Who's we? Folks around here, neighbors, people who cared about her. Tom stepped closer. People who knew she deserved better than a drunk who couldn't hold down a job or keep his hands off a bottle. The accusation stung because it had been true. Jake had been drinking too much, had been angry and lost and impossible to live with, but he'd never hurt Sarah, never would have hurt her. I loved her, he said quietly. Love ain't always enough. Tom moved toward the door, pausing on the threshold. Take some advice, Jake. Fix up your cabin, enjoy your retirement, and leave the past buried. Some stones are better left unturned. After Tom's truck disappeared down the mountain road, Jake pulled out the photograph again. Sarah's eyes seemed to look directly at him, and for the first time in 20 years, he thought he saw something other than goodbye in her expression. He saw fear. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pines as Jake sat on the cabin's front steps, Sarah's journal open in his weathered hands. He'd been reading since dawn, each page revealing another piece of the woman he thought he'd known completely. The entries spoke of dreams she'd never shared with him, a desire to travel beyond the mountains, to see the ocean, to understand why her mother had really left when Sarah was just 7. February 12th, 1998. Jake thinks I don't notice how he watches me sometimes, like he's waiting for me to disappear. Maybe he knows something I don't. Maybe the women in my family are cursed to vanish. The words hit him like a physical blow. He had watched her that way, hadn't he? But not because he expected her to leave, because he couldn't believe someone like her had chosen to stay with someone like him. His love had been tainted with insecurity, and apparently she'd felt it. Detective Martinez's patrol car pulled up the dirt road, dust swirling in its wake. She emerged carrying 2 coffee cups and a manila folder, her expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. Thought you might need caffeine, she said, handing him a cup. And I brought some information you're not going to like. Jake closed the journal carefully, as if it might crumble at too harsh a touch. What did you find? Martinez settled beside him on the steps, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something light and floral that reminded him Sarah used to wear wildflowers in her hair. The thought felt like betrayal. The hair sample came back. It's definitely Sarah's. DNA matches what we had on file from when she went missing. She opened the folder, revealing photographs of the jewelry and other items they'd found. But here's the thing. The decomposition pattern, the way everything was preserved. Jake, These items weren't buried 20 years ago. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, dark liquid splashing across the weathered wood. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone put these things here much more recently. Maybe 5 years ago, 10 at most." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Someone wanted them to be found." Jake's mind reeled. If the items had been planted, then everything he'd assumed about Sarah's disappearance was wrong. But why? Who would do that? "That's what we need to figure out." Martinez pulled out a photograph of the locket, zoomed in to show the inscription inside. "Did Sarah ever mention anyone named M?" "The inscription says, 'To S, forever yours, M.'" Jake stared at the image, his world tilting on its axis. I gave her that locket. For our first anniversary." His voice came out barely above a whisper. "The inscription said, 'To S, forever yours, Jake.' I remember because the jeweler had to squeeze in all the letters." "Someone changed it," Martinez said quietly. "Removed your name. Added an M, professional work. You can barely see where the original engraving was." The implications crashed over him like an avalanche. Someone had taken Sarah's locket, altered it, and buried it with her other belongings in a cabin that didn't exist 20 years ago. Someone who wanted him to find it, wanted him to question everything he believed about his wife's disappearance. "There's more," Martinez continued, pulling out another document. "I did some digging into the poker game where you won this cabin. The man who lost it to you, Frank Morrison, he's interesting. Moved to the area about 15 years ago, bought several properties sight unseen, paid cash, no clear source of income, no local connections." "Morrison," Jake repeated, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. He'd seemed like just another down-on-his-luck gambler, eager to make one last desperate bet. "You think he wanted me to win the cabin?" "I think someone's been orchestrating this for a long time. The question is, why now? What changed that made them want you to start digging into the past?" Jake opened Sarah's journal again, flipping to an entry near the end. The handwriting was different here, shakier, more urgent. "March 3rd, 1998, he found my letters to Mom. He knows I've been asking questions about her disappearance. I'm scared. If something happens to me, I hope someone finds this someday. I hope they look for the truth. The Riverside Motel. Room 7. That's where it started." "Martinez," he said, his voice hoarse. "Look at this." She read over his shoulder, her breath catching. "The Riverside Motel burned down 5 years ago. Electrical fire," they said. "Destroyed all the records." 5 years ago, around the time someone had buried Sarah's belongings in the cabin. Jake felt pieces of a massive, terrible puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture he wasn't sure he was ready to see. "Someone's been cleaning up loose ends," he said, "and now they want me to know about it. They want me to understand what really happened to Sarah." Martinez stood, her hand moving unconsciously to her service weapon. "The question is, are they planning to let you live long enough to do anything about it?" The sheriff's cruiser kicked up dust as it pulled away from the cabin, leaving Jake alone with the deafening silence of the mountains. He stood in the doorway, watching the tail lights disappear around the bend, Clara's jewelry box clutched against his chest like a lifeline. 20 years of believing she'd abandoned him, 20 years of drinking himself into oblivion every anniversary of her disappearance, 20 years of wondering what he'd done wrong, what words he should have said differently, what kind of husband lets his wife slip away without even noticing the signs. All of it built on a lie. Jake stumbled back inside, his legs unsteady. The cabin felt different now, charged with a malevolent energy that made his skin crawl. Every shadow seemed to hide secrets. Every creak of the old timber sounded like whispered confessions. He set the jewelry box on the makeshift table and opened it again, needing to confirm what he'd seen wasn't some alcohol-induced hallucination. Clara's wedding ring caught the lamplight, throwing tiny rainbows across the cabin walls. He picked it up with trembling fingers, remembering the day he'd slipped it onto her finger at the courthouse in Millfield. She'd worn a simple blue dress and carried wildflowers she'd picked that morning. No fancy ceremony, no guests, just the two of them promising forever to each other. She never would have taken it off willingly. The thought hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. Clara had been religious about wearing her ring, twisting it around her finger when she was nervous, polishing it clean every Sunday morning. Even during their worst fights, even when she'd thrown dishes and screamed about his drinking, the ring had stayed put. Jake's mind raced backward through the months before her disappearance. He'd been working double shifts at the lumber mill, trying to save enough money to buy them a real house down in town. Clara had been restless, talking about wanting to travel, see something beyond these mountains. He'd dismissed her dreams as foolishness, telling her they needed to be practical, responsible. Had someone else listened to those dreams? Someone who'd promised her adventure and delivered death instead? The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending pine branches scraping against the roof. Jake moved to the spot where he'd found the jewelry box, kneeling beside the hole in the floorboards. Sheriff Hendricks and his deputy had poked around for an hour, taking photos and measurements, but they'd been focused on the obvious evidence. Jake had noticed something else, a dark stain on one of the support beams, about the size of his palm. He grabbed a flashlight and aimed it into the crawl space. The stain was definitely there, and when he looked closer, he could see scratches in the wood nearby. Deep gouges, like something had been dragged across the beam, or someone. A car door slammed outside, making Jake jump. He scrambled to his feet, heart hammering as footsteps approached the cabin. Through the window he saw a familiar silhouette against the porch light. "Jake, you in there?" Elena's voice carried a note of concern that made something twist in his chest. He opened the door, and she stepped inside, shaking rain from her dark hair. She must have seen his face because she immediately moved closer, her hand finding his arm. "I heard about what happened," she said softly. "Mrs. Henderson at the post office told me the sheriff was up here. I wanted to make sure you were okay." Jake almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Okay? His wife had been murdered, hidden beneath this cabin for 2 decades, while he'd tortured himself with guilt and whiskey. The word okay didn't seem to exist in his vocabulary anymore. "She didn't leave me," he said, his voice cracking. "All these years I thought, but she didn't leave." Elena's eyes found the jewelry box on the table, understanding dawning in her expression. She pulled him into her arms without hesitation, and Jake collapsed against her, 20 years of suppressed grief finally breaking free. He sobbed into her shoulder while she held him steady, her hand stroking his hair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Jake." They stayed like that until the storm passed, rain drumming against the windows while Jake emptied himself of decades of pain. When he finally pulled back, Elena's shirt was damp with his tears, but she didn't seem to care. "What happens now?" she asked. Jake looked around the cabin that had promised him a fresh start and delivered only more questions. Somewhere in these mountains was a killer who destroyed his life and walked away clean. Someone who'd let him suffer for 20 years while Clara's body lay hidden beneath rotting floorboards. "Now I find out who did this," Jake said, his voice steady for the first time since he'd pried open that jewelry box. "And I make them pay." Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and rain and something else, something that smelled like justice, long overdue. Jake's hands trembled as he held the photograph against the morning light streaming through the cabin's broken window. 20 years had blurred his memory of Sarah's face, but this picture was crystal clear. Her warm brown eyes, the constellation of freckles across her nose, that half smile she wore when she thought nobody was watching. What gutted him wasn't just seeing her again, it was seeing her bound to a chair, terror etched in every line of her expression. Behind the photograph, tucked into the same envelope, he found a handwritten note. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. His heart hammered as he read the spidery handwriting, "Payment received. Job completed as requested. No one will find her where she's gone. MC." The envelope itself bore a return address that made his blood run cold. Morrison Construction, the same company that had built half the cabins in these mountains back in the 80s and 90s. Jake remembered the name from when he and Sarah had looked into building their own place before everything fell apart. He sank onto an overturned crate, the photograph still clutched in his shaking fingers. All these years he'd told himself that Sarah had simply grown tired of his drinking, his failures, his inability to hold down steady work. The note she'd supposedly left had been brief, just a few lines about needing space and time to think. He'd been too drunk and too proud to fight for her, too convinced that he deserved abandonment. But this photograph told a different story entirely. Jake studied every detail of the image, searching for clues about where it might have been taken. The background showed rough wooden walls, similar to dozens of cabins scattered throughout these mountains. But there, in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, a distinctive knot in the wood paneling that looked like a twisted face. He'd seen that pattern before. His mind raced back through decades of hiking these trails, hunting in these woods, drinking away his sorrows in various hideouts. That wood-grain pattern, where had he seen it? The realization hit him like a physical blow. The old Mackenzie place, abandoned since the family moved to Denver in the early 90s. The cabin sat on a remote ridge about 10 miles northeast, accessible only by an overgrown logging road that most people had forgotten existed. Jake had sheltered there during a particularly brutal winter storm about 5 years ago, and he distinctly remembered that warped wood panel because it had reminded him of a screaming face. He stuffed the photograph and note into his jacket pocket and grabbed his hiking gear. If there were answers to be found, they'd be at that cabin. But as he prepared to leave, doubt crept in. 20 years was a long time. Even if Sarah had been taken there initially, she could be anywhere by now, or nowhere at all. The hike to the Mackenzie cabin took him 3 hours through increasingly rough terrain. The old logging road had been reclaimed by forest, forcing him to navigate by memory and instinct. His legs ached and his lungs burned, but adrenaline kept him moving forward. When the cabin finally came into view, Jake's heart sank. The structure was even more deteriorated than he remembered. Roof partially collapsed, walls green with moss, windows long since shattered by falling branches. It looked like a place where hope went to die, but he had to look. The front door hung crooked on broken hinges. Jake pushed it open carefully, wincing at the sharp creak that echoed through the forest. Inside, debris covered everything. Rotted leaves, broken glass, the accumulated detritus of 2 decades. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, creating pools of light in the gloom. He pulled out his phone's flashlight and began a systematic search, checking every room, every corner, every shadow. In what had once been the main living area, he found the wall from the photograph. The distinctive wood grain was unmistakable, though now it was stained dark with water damage and age. But there was something else. Near the base of the wall, partially hidden beneath a pile of debris, something metallic caught the light. Jake knelt and carefully moved aside rotted boards and soggy leaves. It was a bracelet, silver, with a small turquoise stone, the bracelet he'd given Sarah for their 2nd wedding anniversary. She'd worn it every day until she disappeared. Jake picked it up with reverent care, his vision blurring with tears. The clasp was broken, as if it had been torn from her wrist. This was real. Sarah had been here. Whatever had happened to his wife, it hadn't been abandonment. As he crouched there holding the only piece of her he'd found in 20 years, Jake heard something that made his blood freeze, the distant sound of a vehicle engine growing closer. Someone else was coming up that forgotten logging road, and given the remoteness of this location, it couldn't be a coincidence. He pocketed the bracelet and moved quickly to the broken window, peering through the trees toward the sound of the approaching engine. The morning light filtered through the cabin's broken windows as Jake sat hunched over the kitchen table. Elena's diary spread before him like a roadmap to his shattered past. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to look away from her familiar handwriting. Each entry was a knife twist, revealing the depth of fear she'd lived with, while he remained obliviously drunk most evenings. Sarah had left an hour earlier, promising to return with supplies and groceries, but Jake suspected she was giving him space to process what they'd discovered. The photographs lay scattered beside the diary, Elena laughing at their wedding, working in her garden, the final image of her looking over her shoulder with haunted eyes. He turned to another entry, dated just 3 weeks before her disappearance. Jake asked about the bruises again today. I told him I fell while hiking, but I can see he doesn't believe me anymore. How do I explain that his own brother has been threatening me for months? That Marcus wants me to leave town, to disappear, because I know too much about his business dealings? Jake idolizes Marcus, always has. It would destroy him to learn the truth. Jake's hands trembled as he read. Marcus had been more than his brother. He'd been Jake's anchor during their turbulent childhood, the steady presence who'd kept him from drowning in their father's violence. When their parents died, Marcus had made sure Jake inherited the family's small savings. When Jake struggled with drinking, Marcus had driven him to meetings. The idea that his brother could have... The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Through the window, Jake watched Sheriff Crawford emerge from his patrol car, moving with the deliberate pace of a man carrying bad news. Jake closed the diary and slipped it beneath a stack of old newspapers just as Crawford knocked. "Morning, Jake." The sheriff's weathered face was grim as he stepped inside. "Heard you and Sarah found some things yesterday. Word travels fast." Small town. Crawford's eyes swept the cabin's interior, lingering on the exposed walls where they'd found Elena's hiding place. "Mind if I take a look at what you discovered?" Jake hesitated, thinking of the diary's revelations about Marcus. His brother had been Crawford's deputy for 15 years before becoming sheriff himself. The two men had worked closely together, shared coffee and complaints about the job. How deep did the connections run? "Depends," Jake said carefully, "on whether you're here as Elena's friend or as someone protecting old secrets." Crawford's expression hardened. "I've been waiting 20 years to find out what happened to your wife, Jake. She was a good woman, and she deserved better than to just vanish without a trace." Something in the sheriff's voice, a note of genuine grief, convinced Jake to retrieve the photographs. He spread them on the table but kept the diary hidden. Crawford studied each image intently, his jaw tightening as he reached the final photograph. "This was taken where?" "Up at Miller's Point, looks like. You can see the old fire tower in the background." Crawford nodded slowly. "I remember that day. Elena had asked me to meet her there, said she had something important to tell me about corruption in the department, but she never showed." Jake's pulse quickened. "She contacted you?" "Left a message with my wife. Said it was urgent, that she had evidence of someone in law enforcement taking money from the Riverside casino operations." Crawford's voice dropped. "I waited 3 hours for her. When she didn't show, I figured she'd gotten scared, decided against getting involved." The pieces began clicking together in Jake's mind. Elena had discovered something about Marcus's connection to the casino. The same casino that had mysteriously burned down 6 months after her disappearance. Insurance fraud, some had whispered, though no charges were ever filed. "Did you investigate her claims?" Crawford's silence stretched uncomfortably long. "I looked into it quietly, but Elena disappeared that same week, and without her testimony or evidence." He shrugged. "Cases go cold, Jake. You know that." But Jake was remembering other things now. Marcus's sudden prosperity around that time, the new truck he'd bought, the down payment on his house. His brother had claimed a successful investment, but Jake had never questioned the details. "Sheriff," Jake said slowly, "what if I told you Elena might have left evidence, documentation of what she'd discovered?" Crawford's attention sharpened. "What kind of documentation?" Before Jake could answer, they heard another vehicle approaching. Through the window, Jake saw Marcus's familiar pickup truck, the same model he'd bought 20 years ago. His brother climbed out, moving with the confident stride of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions. "Jake," Marcus called out, his voice carrying false cheer. "Heard you had some excitement yesterday. Found some old junk in the walls?" Jake met Crawford's eyes and saw recognition there. The sheriff was putting pieces together too. When Marcus knocked and entered without waiting for permission, his smile faltered slightly at seeing Crawford. "Sheriff, didn't expect to find you here. Just following up on some new developments in an old case," Crawford replied evenly. Marcus's gaze swept the table, taking in the scattered photographs, and Jake watched his brother's face carefully as he reached the final image, Elena looking fearfully over her shoulder. For just a moment, Marcus's mask slipped, and Jake saw something cold and calculating beneath. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it pulled away from the cabin, leaving Jake alone with the echo of Deputy Morrison's parting words still ringing in his ears. "We'll be in touch about next steps." The official tone had done nothing to calm the storm brewing in Jake's chest. He stood on the sagging porch, watching the taillights disappear around the bend, and felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on him like a landslide. The evidence bags containing Sarah's jewelry and the threatening letters were gone now, locked away in some sterile evidence room where strangers would catalogue his wife's final moments. The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the clearing. Jake pulled his jacket tighter and stepped back inside the cabin, but the walls felt like they were closing in. Every shadow seemed to hide another secret. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like whispered accusations. He needed air. He needed space to think. Jake grabbed his flashlight and headed into the woods behind the cabin, following a deer trail he'd noticed during his first exploration of the property. The beam of light carved a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating gnarled tree roots and frost-silvered ferns. His breath came out in visible puffs as he climbed higher up the mountainside. 20 minutes of steady hiking brought him to a rocky outcropping that overlooked the valley below. The lights of Millbrook twinkled in the distance like fallen stars, and somewhere among them was the house he'd once shared with Sarah, the house where she'd kissed him goodbye on what he thought was just another ordinary Tuesday morning. Jake sat down on a boulder still warm from the day's sun and tried to piece together the timeline. Sarah had disappeared in October, just as the leaves were turning. If she'd been killed, and the word still felt like swallowing glass, then her body had been hidden somewhere for 20 years. But where, and why had her belongings ended up in Charlie Brennan's cabin? The more Jake thought about Charlie, the less the man made sense. Everyone in town had described him as a loner, maybe a little odd but harmless. Yet someone had been sending him threatening letters, accusing him of terrible things. Had Charlie been involved in Sarah's disappearance? Or was he just another victim of whoever had really taken her? A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness behind him. Jake spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the trees, but found nothing except shifting shadows and the gleam of nocturnal eyes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Just a deer, or maybe a raccoon. But his heart hammered against his ribs anyway. The paranoia was getting worse. Every time a car drove past the cabin, Jake found himself checking the locks. Every unexpected sound made him reach for the tire iron he'd started keeping by the door. If Sarah's killer was still alive, still in Millbrook, then Jake's discovery might have painted a target on his own back. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen, thumb hovering over Elena's contact information. She'd given him her number after their dinner, insisting he call if he needed anything. Part of him wanted to hear her voice, to feel that connection to someone who understood what it meant to lose everything. But what could he possibly say? "Hi, remember how I told you my wife left me? Turns out she was probably murdered, and I might be next." Jake pocketed the phone without making the call. He'd already dragged enough people into this mess. The sound of an engine reached him from far below, a truck or SUV winding its way up the mountain road. Jake watched the headlights sweep around the curves, expecting them to continue past his turnoff toward the hunting camps higher up. Instead, the vehicle slowed and turned onto the narrow dirt track that led to his cabin. Ice formed in Jake's stomach. He killed his flashlight and crouched behind the boulder, straining his eyes in the darkness. The headlights moved steadily closer, then stopped in the clearing beside his truck. A door slammed, followed by footsteps on the cabin's front porch. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the sheriff had come back with more questions. Maybe it was Elena, worried about him after their conversation. Maybe it was just someone who'd gotten lost and needed directions. Or maybe it was someone who didn't want Jake digging any deeper into Sarah's fate. The footsteps moved around the cabin's perimeter, and Jake caught a glimpse of a flashlight beam playing across the windows. Whoever it was seemed to be checking if anyone was home. When they found the cabin empty, would they leave or would they wait? Jake's hands shook as he pulled out his phone again, this time to call 911. But when he looked at the screen, he saw the dreaded words that had haunted him his entire life. No signal. 40 years of bad luck wasn't done with him yet. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it pulled away, leaving Jake standing alone in his driveway with Detective Martinez's card clutched in his weathered hand. The silence that followed felt different now. Not the familiar solitude he'd grown accustomed to over the years, but something heavier, pregnant with possibilities he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He walked back toward the cabin ruins, Sarah's letter still folded in his shirt pocket. The forensics team had been thorough, marking areas with small flags and taking photographs from every conceivable angle. They'd found more than he'd initially discovered: fabric fibers caught on a nail behind the false wall, what appeared to be scratches in the wood that could have been made by fingernails, and most disturbing of all, traces of blood that had seeped between the floorboards. Jake's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, his third in the past hour. He'd quit smoking 15 years ago, but had bought a pack from the general store after the sheriff left yesterday. Some habits, it seemed, never truly died. They just waited for the right catastrophe to resurrect them. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and approaching rain. Storm clouds were gathering over the peaks, dark and ominous against the afternoon sky. He thought about Sarah, how she'd always loved the drama of mountain thunderstorms. She'd stand on their old porch with her arms outstretched, face turned toward the sky, laughing as the first drops began to fall. "You're going to get struck by lightning one day," he'd warned her more than once. "Then what a way to go," she'd always replied, that mischievous glint in her green eyes. Now, staring at the evidence flags scattered around the ruins, Jake wondered if she'd gotten her wish for drama after all, just not the kind either of them had ever imagined. His phone buzzed. The display showed Ellen's number, and he almost didn't answer. He wasn't ready to explain everything to her yet, wasn't ready for the questions and the sympathy and the inevitable suggestions about counseling or therapy or healthy grieving processes. "Hello? Dad? I just heard on the news something about police at your place. Are you okay?" Jake closed his eyes. Of course it had made the news. In a county this small, the discovery of potential evidence in a 20-year-old missing person case was probably the biggest story since the mill closed. "I'm fine, Ellen. Just some old business being looked into." "Old business?" "Dad, the reporter said they found evidence related to Mom's disappearance." "What's going on?" The raw concern in his daughter's voice nearly broke him. Ellen had been 22 when Sarah vanished, just starting her career as a teacher, still young enough to believe that missing people always came home eventually. She'd spent years visiting, calling regularly, trying to bridge the growing distance between herself and her father, who seemed to retreat further into the mountains with each passing season. "They found some things," Jake said carefully. "Things that suggest your mother might not have left voluntarily." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustle of wind through the pine boughs and Ellen's sharp intake of breath. "What kind of things?" Jake looked at the flags marking where Sarah's letter had been found, where the blood traces were discovered. "I can't discuss details. It's an active investigation now." "I'm coming up there." "Ellen, no." "Dad, don't even try to talk me out of this. If there's new evidence about Mom, I have a right to know. I'm driving up tomorrow morning." The line went dead before Jake could protest further. He stared at the phone, then slipped it back into his pocket beside Sarah's letter. Ellen's arrival would complicate things. She'd want to read the letter, would have questions he couldn't answer, would want to hope in ways that might only lead to more pain. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy against the dusty ground. Jake walked over to the blue tarp the forensics team had left to protect the excavated area. He secured the corners with additional rocks, his movements automatic and methodical. The physical task gave him something to focus on, besides the chaos churning in his mind. Thunder rumbled across the valley, and Jake found himself remembering another storm, 20 years and 3 months ago. Sarah had been restless that night, pacing the cabin, jumping at every sound. He'd attributed it to the weather. She'd always been sensitive to barometric pressure changes. But what if it had been something else? What if she'd been scared, sensing danger he'd been too oblivious to notice? The rain began in earnest now, drumming against the cabin's remaining roof sections and turning the excavated dirt to mud. Jake stood in the downpour, letting it soak through his clothes, wash down his face, mingle with tears he didn't realize he was shedding. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called, its voice harsh and questioning against the storm. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it wound up the mountain road toward Jake's property. Deputy Martinez gripped the steering wheel tighter with each hairpin turn, stealing glances at the grim-faced man beside him. Sheriff Coleman hadn't spoken since they'd left the station, his jaw set like granite as he stared at the evidence bag containing the jewelry and bone fragments they'd found in the cabin's walls. Jake waited on his porch, Sarah beside him with her hand resting on his shoulder. The past 3 days had aged him a decade. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually steady hands trembled as he lifted a cup of coffee to his lips. The coffee had long since gone cold. "They're here," Sarah said softly as the cruiser pulled into the clearing. Coleman emerged from the passenger side, his uniform crisp despite the heat. He'd been sheriff for 15 years, but Jake remembered him as a rookie deputy who'd taken the missing person report when Ellen vanished. Back then, Martinez had been earnest and hopeful, promising they'd find her. Now his face carried the weight of unsolved cases and uncomfortable truths. Jake Coleman nodded toward the porch. "We need to talk." "I figured as much." Jake stood slowly, his joints protesting after another sleepless night. "You run those tests?" "We did." Coleman's voice was measured, professional. "The bone fragments are human, female, age consistent with Ellen at the time of her disappearance." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, even though he'd been preparing himself for this moment. Sarah's grip on his shoulder tightened. "The jewelry tested positive for Ellen's DNA," Coleman continued. "Hair follicles still attached to the necklace clasp." Jake closed his eyes. 20 years of wondering, of hoping she might still be out there somewhere, crashed down around him. So she never left. "No, Jake, she didn't leave." Deputy Martinez shifted uncomfortably, his young face pale. This was his first murder investigation, and it showed. He kept glancing between Jake and the sheriff, as if expecting one of them to provide answers that would make sense of it all. "We're treating this as a homicide," Coleman said. "I have to ask, where were you the night of September 15th, 20 years ago?" "You know damn well where I was." Jake's voice cracked with exhaustion and grief. "Same place I told you then. Home, waiting for her to come back from town. Thought she'd run off with that traveling salesman who'd been sniffing around." Sarah stepped forward, her journalist instincts kicking in. "Sheriff, who owned that cabin 20 years ago? Jake just won it in a poker game last month." Coleman consulted his notepad. "Property records show it belonged to Robert Hendricks until his death 3 years ago. Before that, it had been in the Hendricks family for generations." The name struck Jake like lightning. "Bobby Hendricks, that smooth-talking son of a bitch who sold insurance door to door? You knew him?" He was the one. Jake's hands clenched into fists. "The traveling salesman I thought Ellen ran off with. He disappeared right after she did. I figured they'd left together." Coleman and Martinez exchanged glances. This was the break they'd been hoping for, the thread that could unravel 20 years of mystery. "Tell us about Hendricks," Coleman said, pulling out a voice recorder. Jake sank back into his chair, the weight of memory heavy on his shoulders. Charming bastard. Had a way with words, always dressed nice. He'd been making rounds through these mountains for months, selling policies to the old-timers. Ellen. He paused, swallowing hard. Ellen was lonely. I was working double shifts at the mine, hardly ever home. When Bobby started coming around, bringing her flowers and compliments, I could see she was smitten. Did you confront him? Once. Told him to stay away from my wife. He just smiled and said Ellen was a grown woman who could make her own choices. Jake's voice turned bitter. Guess he made the choice for her. Sarah squeezed his shoulder. Jake, this isn't your fault, isn't it? If I'd been a better husband, if I'd paid more attention to her instead of burying myself in work, if you'd done that, Coleman interrupted, you might be dead too. Hendricks clearly wasn't planning on leaving witnesses. The sheriff turned toward the cabin, its skeletal frame stark against the mountain backdrop. We're going to tear the rest of that place apart. If Ellen's there, we're going to find her, and we're going to find out exactly what Bobby Hendricks did. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a figure emerged from the tree line. Old Pete Morrison, the mountain's unofficial historian, shuffled toward them with his characteristic limp. Heard you boys were asking about Bobby Hendricks, Pete called out, his weathered face grave. There's something you need to know about that family. Something folks around here have been keeping quiet for a long, long time. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up dust as it pulled into Jake's makeshift camp beside the ruins of the cabin. Sarah emerged first, her face grim, followed by Sheriff Coleman, whose weathered features looked older than Jake remembered. Behind them came a woman Jake didn't recognize, tall, angular, carrying a metal briefcase. This is Detective Martinez from the State Bureau, Coleman said without preamble. She specializes in cold cases. Jake's stomach clenched. The formality of it all made everything suddenly real in a way that finding the bones hadn't. This wasn't just his private nightmare anymore. Martinez stepped forward, her dark eyes scanning the excavation site with professional detachment. Mr. Torino, I understand you've made some disturbing discoveries here. That's one way to put it. Jake's voice came out rougher than intended. He gestured toward the carefully marked area where he'd found the remains. It's all still there, just like I left it. The detective nodded and set down her case. I'll need to document everything before we proceed. This site is now officially a crime scene. She paused, studying Jake's face. I know this is difficult, but I have to ask, are you prepared for what we might find? Jake felt Sarah's hand slip into his, warm and steady. 20 years of wondering, of lying awake nights constructing elaborate fantasies about Emma running away with another man, about her starting fresh somewhere far from their mountain poverty. The truth had always been here, buried 3 feet under the cabin where they'd planned to grow old together. I've been prepared for 20 years, he said. Just didn't know it. Martinez opened her case and began removing equipment. Cameras, measuring tools, evidence bags. Sheriff Coleman briefed me on the timeline. Your wife disappeared in March of 2004? March 15th. The date was burned into Jake's memory. I came home from a construction job in town. She was just gone. Any signs of struggle, missing belongings? Jake had replayed that day countless times. Her clothes were still there, purse too, but her grandmother's ring was missing, the one she never took off. He swallowed hard. I told myself she took it because it was valuable. Easier to think that than to think someone took it from her, Martinez finished gently. The detective worked with methodical precision, photographing everything from multiple angles before carefully beginning to expose more of the remains. Jake found himself holding his breath, as if noise might somehow disturb Emma's rest after all these years. Jake. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. You don't have to watch this. But he couldn't look away. This was Emma, his Emma, who used to sing off-key while cooking breakfast, who laughed at her own jokes, who cried during every movie they watched together. She'd been here all along, while he'd spent 2 decades hating her for leaving. There's something else, Martinez said, using a small brush to clear dirt from around the skeleton's hand. Looks like fabric preserved by the soil conditions, and she leaned closer, her expression sharpening. There's something metallic here. Jake's heart hammered as she carefully extracted a small object, placing it in an evidence bag. Even through the plastic, he recognized it immediately. Her grandmother's ring. The words came out strangled. She was wearing it. Martinez sealed the bag and made notes on the label. We'll need to examine everything properly at the lab, but this does change the narrative somewhat. If robbery was the motive, the killer wouldn't have left something this valuable. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. Jake, I have to ask this officially now. Where were you on March 15th, 2004? Working a roofing job for Tom Henderson in town. 10-hour day. Didn't get home until almost dark. Jake's voice was hollow. Tom's been dead 5 years now, but his wife might remember. We'll check everything, Martinez assured him. This investigation will be thorough. As the afternoon wore on, Jake watched them work with growing numbness, each bone carefully excavated, each scrap of fabric catalogued. The remnants of a life reduced to evidence tags and photographs. How long? He asked suddenly. How long before you know for sure it's her? Dental records, if available. DNA comparison if needed. Few weeks, maybe less. Martinez looked up from her work. But Mr. Torino, given the circumstances, the location, the ring, I think you already know. Jake nodded slowly. He'd known the moment he saw that first glimpse of bone. Some part of him had probably known for 20 years, buried under layers of anger and self-pity. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the crime scene, Jake realized his 40-year streak of bad luck had finally run out. Not because his fortune had changed, but because he finally understood that losing Emma hadn't been bad luck at all. It had been murder. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up dust as it pulled away from the cabin, leaving Jake standing in the sudden quiet with Sarah's journal clutched against his chest. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long shadows across the clearing where his whole world had just shifted on its axis. Sarah was alive. The thought hammered in his chest like a second heartbeat as he walked back toward the cabin. 20 years of guilt, 20 years of wondering if he could have done something different, 20 years of believing he'd failed her, and she'd been running from something he never even knew existed. He pushed open the cabin door and sank into the old chair by the window, opening the journal again. His hands trembled as he turned to an entry dated 3 months before her disappearance. Jake asked about the bruises on my arms today. I told him I fell in the garden, but I could see he didn't believe me. How can I tell him the truth? How can I tell him that Detective Morrison has been watching our house, following me to work, making it clear that my silence is the only thing keeping Jake safe? Jake's blood turned cold. Detective Morrison. He remembered the man, tall, always impeccably dressed, with eyes like winter. He'd been the one investigating Sarah's disappearance, the one who'd suggested maybe she'd just gotten tired of mountain life and moved on. The next entry made his stomach clench. Morrison showed me the photographs today. Jake leaving the hardware store, Jake chopping wood behind our house, Jake talking to Tom Henley at the diner. Accidents happen all the time in these mountains, Morrison said, especially to men who ask too many questions about things that don't concern them. I wanted to scream, to fight, but all I could think about was Jake's laugh, the way he hums while he works, how he deserves so much better than to be caught up in whatever Morrison is hiding. Jake flipped ahead, his heart racing. The entries became more frantic, more desperate. I found out what Morrison is really protecting. It's not just corruption, it's murder. The land deals, the missing hikers, the bodies that were never found. He's been covering for someone powerful, someone who sees these mountains as their personal hunting ground. And somehow, I stumbled into the middle of it when I witnessed something I should never have seen. The cabin door creaked open, and Jake looked up to see Elena standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her usually confident demeanor shaken. The dental records came back, she said quietly. The woman in the cabin wasn't Sarah. Jake nodded, holding up the journal. I know. She's alive, Elena. Sarah's alive. Elena stepped inside, closing the door behind her. There's something else. We ran the dental records through missing persons databases. The woman we found was Maria Santos, a journalist from Denver who disappeared 5 years ago. She'd been investigating illegal hunting operations in remote areas. The pieces clicked together in Jake's mind like tumblers in a lock. Morrison's still active, isn't he? Still covering for whoever killed her. Morrison retired 10 years ago, Elena said, but her expression was troubled. But Jake, his replacement is Sheriff Bradley, the man I've been reporting to about this case. The implications hit them both at the same time. Elena sank into the chair across from Jake, her face ashen. If Bradley's involved, then everyone who knows about this investigation is in danger. You, me, Sarah, wherever she is. Jake turned to the final entry in the journal, dated the day before Sarah's disappearance. I can't wait any longer. Morrison is getting impatient and his threats are escalating. Tonight, I'm going to stage my own disappearance. I've been preparing for months. New identity documents, money hidden in safe places, a route that will keep me off their radar. It's the only way to protect Jake, even if it means breaking both our hearts. Someday, when this is over, when Morrison and his people are brought to justice, maybe I can come home. Maybe Jake will forgive me for the pain I'm about to cause. I love him too much to let them destroy him because of my mistakes. Jake's vision blurred as he read the words. She'd sacrificed everything to protect him, had lived 20 years in exile because she'd stumbled onto something that would have gotten them both killed. We have to find her, he said, looking up at Elena, before Bradley realizes what we know. Elena nodded grimly. There's a problem with that. I sent my preliminary report to the state police this morning, copying Bradley as protocol requires. If he's involved, he knows we're getting close to the truth. As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles approaching echoed through the trees. Jake moved to the window and peered out through the curtains. 3 Sheriff's Department SUVs were winding up the mountain road, their light bars flashing but silent. Too late, Jake whispered. They're already here. Elena was on her feet immediately, checking her weapon. Is there another way out of here? Jake grabbed Sarah's journal and headed for the back door, through the woods. But Elena, we're not just running from Bradley. If Sarah's right, we're running from people who've been killing to keep their secrets for decades. The vehicles were getting closer, their engines growing louder in the mountain quiet. The sheriff's cruiser sat in Jake's driveway like a bad omen, its red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the newly rebuilt cabin. Jake's hands trembled as he walked up the familiar path, each step feeling like it might be his last as a free man. Deputy Morrison stood by the front door, his face grave. Jake, Morrison nodded. Sheriff wants to see you. Inside, Sheriff Caldwell sat at Jake's kitchen table, a manila folder spread before him. The photographs Jake had found were arranged in a neat row, along with Sarah's jewelry and what looked like official documents. Jake's throat went dry. Sit down. Jake Caldwell's voice was gentler than expected. Jake lowered himself into the chair across from the sheriff, his eyes fixed on Sarah's wedding ring glinting under the overhead light. 20 years of wondering, and now the truth was finally here. We ran the prints on that jewelry, Caldwell began. Confirmed it belonged to Sarah. Also had our forensics team examine those photographs and the cabin's foundation where you found them. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. And? The concrete work dates back about 20 years, give or take. Matches the time frame of Sarah's disappearance. Caldwell leaned forward. Jake, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the night she vanished. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush. Jake told him about the fight, their worst ever, about Sarah storming out and his pride keeping him from following, about waking up hungover and ashamed, finding her note on the kitchen counter saying she needed space, about the days that stretched into weeks, then months, of waiting for her to come home. Did you ever suspect she might not have left willingly? Caldwell asked. Not at first. We'd been having problems, money troubles. I figured she just had enough. Jake's voice cracked. It wasn't until months later that I started wondering. Sarah wouldn't have left her mother's necklace behind. She wouldn't have left without Rusty. Caldwell nodded. Her dog. Found him 3 days later, wandering the road near Miller's place, hurt and half-starved. Jake's hands clenched into fists. That's when I knew something was wrong, but by then everyone already assumed she'd left you. The truth hung heavy in the air. Jake had been the obvious suspect from the beginning. The drunk, unstable husband with a history of bar fights. When Sarah didn't turn up dead in those first crucial weeks, the case had quietly shifted from missing person to abandoned spouse. "We brought Charlie Miller in for questioning this morning," Caldwell said. "Found some interesting things in his house. Sarah's driver's license, more photographs, a diary." Jake's vision blurred. A diary. She'd been documenting his behavior for months before she disappeared. Following her, showing up at her work, leaving notes. Classic stalking pattern. Caldwell's jaw tightened. The last entry was dated the day she vanished. She wrote that she was scared to go home because she'd seen his truck parked near your property. The room spun. Jake gripped the table edge, understanding flooding through him like ice water. He was watching our house. Appears that way. We think he intercepted her that night when she left after your fight. The diary indicates she planned to stay at her sister's in Portland, cool off for a few days, then come back to work things out. Tears Jake had held back for 2 decades finally broke free. Sarah hadn't abandoned him. She'd planned to come home, to forgive him, to try again. Miller's not talking yet, but his lawyer's already hinting at a deal. With the evidence we've found. Caldwell gathered the photographs. I think we'll have answers soon. After the sheriff left, Jake sat alone in the silence of his rebuilt cabin. Everything looked different now. The careful woodwork, the polished floors, the windows that let in so much light. He'd built this place as a monument to lost love, never knowing it was also Sarah's tomb. He walked outside to where he'd scattered wildflower seeds over the disturbed earth near the foundation. Tiny green shoots were already pushing through the soil, reaching toward the sun. In a few months, this spot would burst with color. Sarah's favorites, Indian paintbrush and mountain lupin. As evening approached, Jake heard the sound of tires on gravel. A familiar blue pickup rounded the bend, and his chest tightened with recognition. Emma parked beside the house and walked toward him, her face soft with understanding. "I heard," she said simply. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. "I know this doesn't change everything," Emma continued, "but at least now you know. She loved you, Jake. She was coming home." As darkness fell over the mountains, Jake stood beside the woman who'd helped him rebuild more than just walls and watched the first stars appear. Somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard Sarah's laughter carried on the wind, finally free. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Jake sat across from Detective Morrison, the manila folder between them thick with 20 years of secrets. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee mug, the ceramic chipped from decades of use, but warm against his palms. "The blood evidence matches," Morrison said quietly. "And the jewelry, her wedding ring, the necklace you described, it's all there. We found more when we excavated beneath where that cabin stood." Jake nodded, though each word felt like a stone settling in his chest. Sarah hadn't left him. She'd never made it past that cursed piece of property that had somehow, impossibly, found its way back to him through a rigged poker game 40 years later. "Garrett Mullins confessed this morning," Morrison continued. "Said he couldn't live with it anymore, especially after he heard we'd found everything. Apparently your wife discovered he was running drugs through that cabin, using it as a way station. When she threatened to report him..." The detective's voice faded as Jake stared out the window toward the mountain where the cabin had stood, where Sarah had died, where some twisted sense of justice, or maybe just dumb luck, had finally brought the truth to light. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Morrison stood to answer it, and Jake heard Emma's voice, soft and concerned. She'd been his anchor these past weeks, helping him navigate the storm of revelations and police interviews. Her presence had made the unbearable somehow bearable. "How is he?" she asked Morrison in the hallway. "About as well as you'd expect. It's closure, but it's still fresh grief." Emma appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair catching the morning light. She'd been staying in town since the investigation began, ostensibly to help with her historical society research. But Jake knew better. She'd sensed he needed someone, even before he'd admitted it to himself. "Coffee?" she offered, moving toward the pot without waiting for an answer. Her movements in his kitchen had become natural, comfortable, a domestic rhythm he'd forgotten existed. Morrison gathered his papers. "We'll need you to come in once more this week for the formal statement, but after that, you should be free of all this legal business. Mullins will likely plea bargain. With his confession and the evidence, there won't be much need for a trial." After the detective left, Jake and Emma sat in companionable silence. The weight of finally knowing what had happened to Sarah pressed against his chest, but it was different from the crushing uncertainty he'd carried for 2 decades. This hurt was clean, finite, a wound that could heal rather than fester. "I keep thinking about the poker game," he said finally. "How Mullins must have felt when I won that cabin. He probably thought he was safe after all these years." Emma reached across the table, covering his weathered hand with hers. Maybe Sarah guided those cards. Maybe she wanted the truth to come out. Jake almost smiled at that. Sarah had always believed in signs, in the universe having a plan. She would have loved the poetic justice of it, her killer's guilt driving him to drink and gambling, leading to the very discovery that would destroy him. "What happens now?" Emma asked. It was the question Jake had been avoiding. For 20 years his life had been shaped by Sarah's absence, by the terrible not knowing. He'd built his hermit existence around that wound, and now he found himself adrift in possibilities he'd forgotten how to imagine. "I've been thinking about that," he said slowly, "about what Sarah would want me to do with the rest of my life." Emma's hand tightened on his, and he saw hope flicker in her green eyes before she carefully schooled her expression back to neutral. "She'd want you to be happy," Emma said simply. "Yes." Jake turned his hand palm up, intertwining their fingers. "She would. She'd probably be furious if she knew I'd wasted 20 years hiding on that mountain, punishing myself for something that wasn't my fault." The tears came then, not just for Sarah, but for all the lost years, all the joy he'd denied himself out of misplaced loyalty to his grief. Emma moved around the table and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as the sobs shook his shoulders. When the storm passed, Jake pulled back to look at her face. "I loved her," he said. "I always will. But I think I could love again too, if someone was patient enough to help me remember how." Emma's smile was radiant. "I think someone might be." Outside, the mountains stood eternal against the blue sky, no longer a prison but simply part of the landscape of his past. Jake squeezed Emma's hand and felt something he hadn't experienced in 40 years, the conviction that his luck might finally be changing. The truth had set him free, and for the first time since Sarah disappeared, Jake began to believe in tomorrow.